Okay, hello there, everyone. We'll get started in just a sec. Can you guys all hear me okay? Hello, Ryan. All right. Okay, so you guys have project 2 due tomorrow. Any questions on that? Kind of last minute things that you need cleared up or anything like that before you turn it in tomorrow? I am on a boat. I live on a sailboat in Puget Sound in Seattle in Ballard. So all my lectures are coming to you guys from the water. Any questions on the project due tomorrow before we move on to the lecture for today? All right. Well, I'll assume you guys are good to go on that for the most part. Just remember, make sure it's saved as a PDF file. The same way you did the last project. Make sure you have each colored illustration labeled with the color scheme that you're using, whether it's monochromatic, whether it's warm colors, whether it's complementary colors, whatever that color scheme is, just label it. And then also label with the type of shot it is. So, close up with warm colors, whatever it may be. And then make sure that PDF has your name on it as well. But yeah, I think that's the main things. Oh, and then you can, if you do have last minute questions or you want some feedback on it to me, you can send it to me later today or tomorrow morning before it's due, and I can try and look it over really quick and say, hey, all looks good, or maybe just change one or two little things before you turn it in. But yeah, other than that, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. And then again, that will kind of lead us into our next project, kind of in terms of the process that we're using. Yeah, I want one drawing per page in that PDF file. I think I have an example somewhere, just a sec. Somewhere. So how each one of these has, each page has its own illustration labeled with what that color scheme is. So yeah, each drawing should be displayed large enough on its own page so I can see it and see, see the details of your drawing and stuff like that. What's your question, Trinity, about the download? Yes, the 4 pages are in one PDF. Do you know how to make that or do that? Let me pull up it's in our tutorial videos. So let me pull that up really quick. The first video. Yeah. Save work as PDF. So there's 2 ways to do it. One is using Adobe Illustrator. If you have experience with that and you have it installed already on your computer, you can use Adobe Illustrator to do that. you guys should all be able to download Illustrator for free, along with those Adobe subscriptions. So if you want to do that and learn how to use Adobe Illustrator, or you've done it already for other classes, another way to do it is to save your work as 4 separate JPEGs and then use this website that's called Convert JPEG to PDF. It's to really, not this one. Actually, this one works too. So either one of these websites, you can just drop, a certain amount of JPEGs in here. For us, for this project, it would be 4 JPEGs. You drop them into this website and then you download a PDF file. So there's 2 ways to do it, whatever would be easier for you. And that link I just sent in the chat has those 2 different ways as like a demo showing you how to do that. Oh, cool. Yeah, Emily. Yeah, if you guys know another way to do it, Emily just said you can do it using Google Docs. Yeah, if you know another way that you've done it before, that I'm fine with, however you get it into a PDF. All right, any other questions on the project? All right, well, if anything comes up during the lecture or at the end of class, feel free to ask it and let me know. And yeah, so I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with. I really like seeing your digital still lifes. Those were good. Had you guys, I saw that you guys a lot of people had like different textures in there, which was good to practice with, different types of objects that you were drawing. You guys, for the most part, did a really good job like matching color to color, which is kind of the goal of those still lifes, like looking at an object, saying this is, a very desaturated dark blue. Now, how do I find that color in Photoshop and recreate it? So that was kind of the goal of that, just learning to look at colors, observe colors, and then identify them and recreate them in your work. So yeah, I would suggest doing those often. If you want to get better at drawing and better at color, you can do that digitally. You can do that with watercolors. You can do that with like acrylic or oil paints, but that's just a really good way to practice color and practice observing color and then recreating it in whatever medium you're using. So yeah, hopefully you guys got a chance to experiment with some different brushes and things like that, doing those exercise or that exercise. So you can use some of those brushes on projects as we're working. All right, so for today, we are going to talk about light and shadow and how to use light and shadow in your work and kind of the principles and, general overview of how light and shadow is used in art and illustration. And then the drawing challenge this week, I'll come up with some sort of drawing challenge where you have to create some light and shadow. So we'll talk about kind of the general principles of it, and then also some stylistic ways that you can use it in your work. So this is probably something that you guys started to observe when you were doing those still lifes. And really the best way to practice that light and shadow is with those still life setups, but setting it up with an intentional light source. So you have a bright light shining on an object that then creates a highlight side and a shadow side, and then you have to try and recreate that with color. So we'll kind of talk about the fundamentals of that, of how to do that. And then you can kind of decide how you want to implement that in your own work. So not every single drawing is going to have light and shadow in it. There's times where you want to use dramatic light and shadow. So if you have like a lot of heavy shadows, usually those are reserved for, moments of high intensity in a story. So if you have an action scene or scene with a lot of drama or a scene with a lot of mystery in it, that's where you really, it's helpful to really use kind of those heavy shadows to accentuate the mood and accentuate the story. You see light and shadow used in different movies in different ways. That's a huge part of movies, is using lighting to create a mood or to create a feeling in a story. There's standard lighting, which is just kind of like everyday lighting that you see, you know, whether just inside a normal room or outside in the middle of the day. But then there's more dramatic lighting where it's coming from different angles, and sometimes it's really intense to create really dark shadows or different colored shadows and things like that. But again, like most things in this class, you know, the type of shot we're using, the type of colors you're using, and now the type of light and shadow that you may be using, you want to use it to match what's going on in the story. So use high intensity shadows for drama, action, mystery, things like that. Okay. So the biggest thing when doing this is to use a consistent light source. So basically that means just you want to imagine whenever you're drawing that there's just one light source shining on all the objects in your illustration. Okay, so you don't want, you know, 3 or 4 different light sources and shadows going all different directions. So basically what that means is, let's say you have a rectangular shape. Let's put a sphere here. Maybe we'll have like a cone over here. So it's also helpful to think about when you have more, so these are very simple, you know, geometric shapes or geometric 3-dimensional forms. When you have more complicated objects, whether it's people or buildings or cars, whatever it is, it's helpful to try and think about it and simplify it down to these simple shapes, because that'll help you figure out what directions the shadow is going and what side of the object the shadow will be on. So whether your light source is coming from here, or, you know, right above, you want to define that before you even start your drawing. So know your light source. And for me, I usually like to sketch in that light source depending on the type of drawing it is. So I just have a kind of visual reminder of where that light source is coming from. So I will sketch it in usually like this. I like to draw kind of a 3-dimensional arrow so I know exactly where that light is coming from. There's our light. Okay. So that means the light will hit this side of all these objects. And so on that side, it'll be light, but then on the opposite side, it will be dark. Okay, so we'll have light here. So then this side will become a shadow. So setting up still lifes is a really good way to observe light and shadow. Painting or drawing anything from real life where there's a light source is a really good way to practice it. So now we have the light side here, the light side here, and the shadow side over here. So that's going to be the same for all of these objects. So on the sphere, this side will be light, and this side will be a shadow. And then on the 3-dimensional cone, we got light side on here and shadow side over here. So now all of those objects have the same consistent light and shadow. And the biggest thing that adding shadows does is it adds volume. So it just makes your objects feel three-dimensional. It makes them feel like they're real solid three-dimensional objects to have those shadows on there. And the way I know kind of the shape that this shadow takes on this sphere down here, because I've practiced and drawn still lifes with spheres and things like that. Has anyone ever taken a still life drawing class or something where you set up a light and draw objects with light and shadow on them, trying to figure out what direction the shadows go before? Good, yeah. So a lot of classes have similar, exercises or studies to this. So again, that's a really good way to practice. So then we'll talk about in just a sec. Oh yeah, in drawing classes. So yeah, this is like a very good general kind of introduction to drawing sort of exercise. So the light's going over here. So then you'll have cast shadows that go away from the light source. So these cast shadows go away. So it would look weird if we have this shadow go in this direction and then we have a shadow going that direction. That would look weird, especially if we know the light source is right there. So all your cast shadows along the ground should be going the same way. So that's a really good way to do it, is just know that light source. So, typically the light source is from above somewhere. Okay. So even if I'm just doing a quick sketch of like a face or whatever, I'll still say, oh, do I want the light coming from here or from the side? But oftentimes, for the most part, in everyday normal life and normal situations, the light is from above somewhere. So above it a little bit of an angle, and that will give you kind of consistent shadows on a face. We'll talk about kind of how it lights up a face, but usually it'll be from above. You can change that drama, and sometimes you see during like creepier, scary scenes where the shadow comes from below, but that has a very different feeling to it, and you want to reserve that for specific moods or moments in your story. So usually that consistent light source will be from above somewhere, above, and usually a slight angle. All right, cast shadow versus core shadow. Has anyone heard of the difference in types of shadows before? I know I've talked about cast shadows with you guys. All right, so I'm just starting here with a middle value right here, just a medium, right in the middle there. And there's two different types of shadows. So cast shadows are the ones that are cast onto the ground, and core shadows are the ones that are on the object itself. Okay, so let's illustrate the difference. So I'm going to do the same thing with the light source. Draw that in. So this one is from above, in front of the object a little bit, and just off to the side. So I want to put in that core shadow. So I'm going to start with this value and make it just a little bit darker. So this shadow here is the core shadow. It's the core shadow is on the object. And the cast shadow is on the ground. So if we were taking, I mean, we could do an entire class, like a quarter-long class just on light and shadow on objects. Studying how, the differences between cast shadow, core shadow, how it works with different types of lighting, how it works with different types of objects. But this really is kind of the general overview. So right now, this is just I call this a flat core shadow, but in reality, when you look at a sphere or a real object, core shadows have a soft edge and cast shadows have a crisp edge. What do I mean by that? Well, right now, the difference between this value and this value has a crisp transition. Okay, so what we would see in reality is a softer, smoother transition from light to dark. So I'm going to use this worn oil brush, which are one of the ones that you had the option to download. So I just want to soften this transition here. Let me I'm going to turn down the opacity of this a little bit. There we go. Now I can soften this so it slowly transitions from the light side to the shadow side. So now you can see the edge of this core shadow is now soft. It's a softer edge there. And I can even start to darken up part of this core shadow here too as well. So as you can see, as I'm adding these, this rendering, this soft edge, the fading from light to dark, it's making it seem more three-dimensional. Okay, so if the light source is right here, what am I gonna get right here on this upper edge of the sphere? Yes, exactly, a highlight. And a highlight, is going to be different depending on what sort of material you're working with. You know, if you're working with human skin, a highlight will act differently than if it's a object made out of wood or an object made out of like reflective chrome, like on a car. Those highlights will act differently. So it's always good to closely observe how highlights work. But usually I like to just be pretty subtle with them. So that highlight is always should be the brightest spot on your object and also the closest to the light source as well. All right, and with this cast shadow down here, you'll get similar things. So right now it's just one flat value, but there is a change in value in that cast shadow. So under here, where that shadow is closest to the object, it's going to get quite dark in there. And as it goes away, it will fade out and get a little bit lighter. But this will be the darkest section right in here. You know how I said it had a crisp edge? It's the crispest edge right closest to the object, and the further away it goes, it will soften up that edge of the shadow just a little bit, but not as much as the way this shadow fades from light to dark, slowly like a gradient. And there's another thing that happens called reflected light, which probably won't come up too much in your guys' illustrations, but I want you just to be aware of it if you see it and you observe it in different drawings. So this light source, as it comes down, some of it will bounce off of the ground and go back into the core shadow. And it will actually create a little bit of lightness right in there. Just a slightly lighter value right along in here. That might be. Okay. It's really, you see that reflected light when you're working with color. So you'll actually see a little bit of color in there as well. Right here is the reflected light. All right. So, yeah, any questions on these, the different types of shadows? So you probably won't be drawing your shadows exactly like this on your illustrations. When I do like comic book work or quicker designed illustrations, I simplified these shadows here. I usually do not draw that core shadow fading. I don't usually draw reflected light. Usually I have a simple hard edge core shadow, a cast shadow, and sometimes a highlight, not always. It depends on the scene and kind of the style I'm working with. So I just want you to be aware of all those different sorts of shadows and the subtle differences of it, even if you're not going to be using it in all of your drawings. So but using that, let's just do, let's draw a little car here. But using those core and cast shadows is going to be helpful even when doing a simplified drawing. So if this is a simplified drawing of a car here, let's just make it kind of a flat blue. I still want to be aware of where those core and cast shadows are, even if I'm not using the most realistic style and realistic rendering of them. So I would say those core shadows are really good to add volume. So core shadows will automatically make something feel three-dimensional. So I recommend using those to give your objects that three-dimensional pop. So here's just a simple flat color without any shadows. And sometimes you can do this. I'll show you some examples where people don't use shadows at all. So you can add just a simple, there's my core shadow for that. On this version, I don't want to add in that soft rendered edge. This is a quicker drawing, a simplified style there. And then we can add in the cast shadow along the ground. Okay. So core shadow adds volume, and then cast shadow adds kind of weight and can ground an object. So we've talked about those cast shadows a lot to show something in motion. Having that cast shadow off the ground. Cast shadows can also show texture and add to the story. So if I draw someone standing there and their cast shadow comes back, if I want to make them standing in grass, I change this cast shadow. I can add this as a textured cast shadow. And that kind of gives the feeling that they're standing in grass there. So even though that's kind of a crispy shadow edge, adding that texture there can help with it. Cast shadows also, depending on, it can show like the slope or the direction of, the ground plane that they're standing on. So now this person's standing on like a hill or a slope or something like that. Cast shadows are also very good for storytelling. So cast shadows here, these cast shadows are helping to tell the story of what's going on. The characters on the slope, the characters running, the characters standing in grass. But you can play around with cast shadows and have a lot of fun. So you'll see them used really dramatically at different times. And you can use this to help create a dramatic moment in your story. Just have some fun with those shadows. See, I see these a lot in like old Disney movies, or not even old Disney movies, just Disney movies in general. They use this a lot. You know, sometimes for humor, sometimes for drama, but using that cast shadow in a way that helps add to that story and adds to mystery or drama. And then, you know, cast shadows also can show information about the time of day or time of year. So if you're in the summer, in the middle of the day, your cast shadow is going to look different. Your cast shadow may just look like this. But if you're in the winter, like at sunset, your cast shadow is going to look like this. You're going to have a very, very long cast shadow. So it can add a lot to those stories with how you choose to use cast shadows in different ways and how you make them work for your given story. So, you know, everything has a specific use for it, but I really like using those cast shadows to help the show just different information. Oftentimes when I'm drawing heads or faces and I want to show the weight of this head, I'll put a cast shadow right here underneath the head that goes onto the neck. When I'm drawing like hats, it can be very fun to add a big cast shadow here that then even goes down onto the body and that hat casting a shadow onto the person. So play around with those cast shadows, try and observe some for real life. Look around as you do some practice drawings and as you do studies and thumbnails for your different projects, to think about how you will use cast shadows in there. You don't need to use cast shadows on the project or shadows, light and shadow on the next project. But I suggest trying it out. So as you're finishing up the projects that are due tomorrow, just think about how you will add in shadows on there. And I would suggest trying it to add some volume to some of your drawings. On the final project, I will want to see some light and shadow in there on your drawing somewhere. So, and then the drawing challenge this week after the project's due, I'll figure out something so you guys can practice drawing light and shadow there. Any questions so far on any of this? All right. So shadows with color. All righty. So you can do, there's just knowing how to use light and shadow. So a lot of that time, just studying that with just black and white using just values is really helpful. But then once we start to introduce color into it, there's a whole bunch of different ways to handle the color as you work with it. So one way you can just do is using black shadows. This is done a lot when you're drawing with pen and ink. This is done a lot for like, you know, traditional kind of comic book look to it. Just to have, just use solid black as the shadow. So again, how you use this will become a stylistic choice. Oftentimes hair becomes all black, especially when you're doing this using black shadows. So this can have a cool, dramatic, moody look to it using black shadows. And then you can always add color to that, and you don't necessarily need to add color variation within the, or yeah, very different colors within there. You can just use the black to work as your shadow. So you can choose to do it that way for your shadows. But there's some different ways if you want to do colored shadows, you can do that as well. So let's just do a simple sphere like the orange basketball again. So we'll just do our orange sphere. So there we go. Okay, so there's a number of different ways I can add on that core shadow to make this feel three-dimensional. So usually kind of the default what I do is just a subtle making this hue darker. Okay, so I'm going to put this up as hue, saturation, brightness sliders. So remember here under this color panels, there's different ways to display your color. Lots of times when I'm adding in shadows and highlights to things, I like to use these bright hue, saturation, brightness sliders. So I'll just take this hue right here, this kind of a light saturated orange, and I'm just going to make the brightness just a little bit darker. So usually this is kind of my default for shadows when it's just kind of a normal scene setting, not too dramatic or too, I don't want it to be, you know, stand out too much in terms of surrounded by other illustrations. I just want to show that this object has some three-dimensional value. So you can also do other things with the color as well when adding those shadows. So I can make it dramatically darker as well. So now there's a little bit more drama on this scene. So I have a dramatically darker shadow there. That'll cause it to pop out a little bit more, feel even more three-dimensional, and really just have a sense of drama for that darker shadow. You can also start to shift the saturation for it. So sometimes I'll make it darker, but I'll also make it more saturated. And that has an interesting look to it as well. Let's bump this up. So then we get this really nice, bright, saturated shadow. I use this a lot of times with skin tones. The skin tones will oftentimes, the shadows will feel kind of like they're glowing with different values. You can also use a completely different hue for that. So I mentioned last class, or yeah, one of the previous classes, lots of times the highlights of an object are slightly warmer, and then the shadows are a cool color. So I can come in and use a blue for the shadow. So I still want it to be a darker value. So first I'm going to make the value darker just to make sure it's dark. And then I can switch to a blue and add in a blue shadow here. So that has a very dramatic feel to it. So that blue really pops out. So I'm going to desaturate that blue so it's not quite as dramatic. So this can have a really cool, you'll see this a lot of time. You'll see this in skin tones as well. You'll really see this in like landscapes during sunsets. So the light side of maybe a mountain gets a very golden orange look to it. And the dark side has a cool blue. You can also just make the shadows cooler by desaturating the yellow, or the orange. So this orange here is more saturated. This orange here, I can just make it darker and then make it less saturated. So this will make the shadow appear cooler, which it is, but it's not a cool color. It's still the same hue. There I can add in a subtle, cooler shadow there. So this is what you'll really kind of want to play around with as you're working, just to see what sort of shadows you want to put onto your objects for intended purposes as well. And lots of times I end up making cast shadows a cool color as well. So right now the shadows are a desaturated blue I'm adding in right now, the cast shadows. So as you see, there's lots of different ways to do that, and that always kind of depends on what flat color you start with. So we were starting with this pretty saturated orange, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. But really, it kind of just takes you experimenting the way you utilize that again. So I will use something more like one of these ones here for more dramatic moments in the story. And something more like these for more subtle moments when I just want to add some three-dimensional form without making it too overly loud or overly dramatic. And then you can also go back to just the use of those black shadows as well, if you want more kind of an ink style or a comic book style as well. Any thoughts or questions on adding these sorts of shadows? All right, let's do another simple still life setup. Let's do it with a couple different color objects. Oops, rectangle. Okay, so I want to make all of these objects 3 different colors for their local flat color. Let's do a reddish. This guy is pretty bright. Let's do a yellowish here. We'll just do kind of a gray for this cube. Okay, so here I have the line work on one layer and the shadows on one layer as well, or the color on one layer. So usually when I'm working, as hopefully you guys saw in those tutorial videos, I'll put the shadows on their own layer. and the flat colors on their own layer as well. All right, I just want to get some basic quick shadows on here and just give you some ideas about using highlights. So the thing about highlights when you add them in, usually you want to be pretty subtle with them. So you don't want to overly use too many highlights. That kind of became a style in comic book drawing in like the late 90s to have these overly rendered highlights that were just kind of that really made everything feel like super glossy and shiny. Like you don't want objects to feel overly shiny unless you're drawing like shiny metal or something that's chrome and really has those bright highlights. So you want to think about when you're adding highlights in here, what color is the light? So light has lots of different colors. So you usually we're most used to kind of orangish, yellowish orangish light, or kind of a white cool light. So fluorescent lights are going to be kind of coolish and white. Most lights inside of a house are kind of yellowish orangish. So I'll just use kind of a yellowish orangish one here. So I'm going to use this yellowish orange color as a highlight. I just want it to be really bright. Something about like that, maybe not quite that bright. So I think that'll be good for the highlight color there. So I don't want to come in and just add that. So usually when I add highlights, I turn the opacity way down on my brush. So I turn that opacity all the way down to about 11%. Again, that's just to keep it subtle. And so the thing when you're adding these in, no matter the color of the object, so you know how we made the shadow a darker red, the shadow a darker yellow. You can use the same color highlight since it's the same light hitting all the objects. So this highlight will hit that yellow on there, that yellowish highlight. Yellowish highlight will hit onto that red, have a red or create an orangish highlight on that red. And it will create a yellowish highlight here on this gray blue as well. And that's because it's the same light source hitting these three different objects, even though they're different colors. Okay. And again, you know, once you get into more details, like observing different materials, different colors, things like that, you'll observe more subtle differences in how highlights interact. But for the most part, I just choose one color for the light source and add that to whatever objects are in a given drawing or given illustration. So I can use that same color on all of the objects. But you also don't need to add highlights necessarily. And oftentimes I'll reserve those highlights again for more dramatic moments as well. Okay. So it's good to practice drawing shadows and highlights and stuff on those very simple shapes. But for the most part, you guys aren't going to be drawing, you know, just simple everyday objects. You're going to be drawing things more complicated, like people, cars, buildings, all that sort of stuff. So when I want to do something more complicated, I try and think of simplifying it down to a simple shape first. So for human heads, usually I'll just use an egg shape. And that can help me to think about that light source on the simple object and how it will react to that face. So if we can figure out the highlight on that simple object, that will help us inform us to where the shadow will go along the face. Okay, so we got there, then there's going to be a cast shadow underneath this object. For here, the cast shadow will be along the neck. But then there's also indents on the face too. So if you think about it from a profile, this side faces up, this side will get shadow. This side faces up, gets highlights, the underside of the nose gets shadow. Top of the mouth gets highlights, the underside and chin gets shadow. So you can add here, underneath the eyes, you're gonna get shadow because those face away from the light. Right here in the middle of the brow faces away from the light, so it's gonna get shadow. The nose will get its own cast shadow because that's a big shape there. Underneath the lip will get shadow. And that's kind of the typical lighting that you'll see. Usually that ear is in shadow as well. But it can shift around too. So let's go back to our face. And again. So maybe it's just coming from top down, straight down, middle of the day, sunny day. So that means the shadow will be along the bottom of the face. You'll still get shadows in the eye sockets. Shadow of the nose will come straight down, maybe a little shadow under the lip there. And the ears will have some shadows in them as well. So again, imagining the shadows on a simplified object will help you to figure out how to draw shadows on more complicated objects. And as long as you keep that light source consistent, that will help you to, make all those shadows consistent on more complicated objects. All right, any questions on light and shadow? So again, keeping it consistent within your illustrations, whichever one of these coloring styles for shadows you choose, you should kind of keep that consistent with the illustration. So, you don't want one part of the shadows to have really saturated shadows and another one to have really subtle shadows. So just think about that as well. All right, let's look at some examples here of different artists. All right, let's just start with the black and white shadow. So here is Frank Miller, comic book artist. He did Sin City. He's done The Dark Knight. So here you can see, actually, let me open this one in Photoshop. He has the light source figured out. So here, the light is coming from the side. So you have highlight, shadow. Highlight here, shadow here. Highlight here, shadow here. Same on the head. Highlight on one side, shadow on one side. So that follows the consistency all the way down the body. For this face here, have the same thing. Have the light coming from that angle. So then you get highlight, shadow, highlight, shadow. Highlight on the nose, shadow on that side of the nose. Highlight above the lip, shadow under the lip. Highlight on the top of the chin, shadow under the chin. So it's consistent across that face and across the entire body. And then if you were doing an entire scene with this, you should keep that consistency within the same scene. But you can see how dramatic, and this just gives it a sense of drama, a sense of power with those heavy dark shadows, a sense of kind of strength there. So decide what your subject matter, how you want to illustrate it and how you want to make it kind of the statement and mood you want it to have, using the type of shot, but then also how you're going to use color and how you're going to use light and shadow. So all these different things we've been talking about from week to week, will be kind of combined in a way to really make a good storytelling illustration. So let's see a few more. I think I have a couple other just black and white. Oh, this is Hellboy, Mike Mignola. He uses solid black shadows in his work really, really well. So just using pure black and pure white, he could then come and just add flat color underneath this line work, without needing to add, a lot of shadows within the color. He could just keep the color flat and let the black and white shadows do the work there. But keeping it consistent on all the characters throughout the scene there. Okay, let's just focus on an example. So here is some concept art from Aladdin. So I just like looking at the tops of these towers, these sphere shapes. So as you can see, they all have the highlight here on the same side. And they're also using a warmer color for the highlight and a cool color for the shadows. So why do you guys think that they made this shadow on that tower a more saturated yellow and a darker value underneath? Why do you think the artist made that choice to make a saturated highlight and a darker shadow there? Any ideas? And maybe why they use the yellow here when the whole scene is pretty much monochromatic. Yeah, exactly, Kevin. So it creates more dramatic volume. It really makes that shape pop out and feel three-dimensional, but also the importance, definitely. So this is the focal point also. So they want your eye to go right here to this tower, the biggest one. So this yellow is going to draw your eye because everything else in here is cool. So that warm color will draw your eye. And then the more dramatic highlights and the darker shadows creates more contrast in here. So that allows this tower to really pop out as the most important one, when in theory, if this was reality, all of these towers would have that same sort of highlight on there. But they made this one right here more dramatic and more important to really pop out as the focal point and make it stand out in this scene. So as we discussed all these rules about light and shadow and consistent colors and consistent light direction, there are times where you want to break those rules. So they broke the rules by making this highlight brighter and more saturated in order to make that stand out as the focal point and really draw the eye here to the center of these towers. So we want to know and learn all the rules, and then there are times where you can shift and break and bend the rules just a little bit to make it work better for your illustration. But you can see the consistency in the shadows with all these little buildings too. You see the light side is that top plane there, and then the dark side are the other planes as well. So consistency in the light source, and then manipulating those rules to really draw our eyes to that big volume up there. So I thought this was a really interesting style here for this comic. So what color are they using for shadows in this comic? What style is this person using? What color shadows are there? Yep, just using the simple black shadows. So I thought this was a really cool look because they really essentially have three colors in here. There's pure black, pure white, and then this kind of desaturated yellowish middle tone. So that creates a really cool look, and they use it to, move your eye around. So here, having the most dramatic light against dark is right in that doorway. Having this cast shadow along the ground here lead our eye to the focal point. Look at this cast shadow created by the brim of the hat there. So when I said that's what I do with a lot of hats, that's because I've seen a bunch of other artists do it, and I just kind of steal that little trick from them. But it's an interesting choice. So he can put shadows in places to draw more attention. So there's more shadows on the people. And then there's not really shadows on the objects here. So, but that doesn't really matter. Okay, so they're just keeping the shadows on the people because it creates more three-dimensional contrast on them and makes them stand out more, where these less important objects, in reality, they would have shadows and highlights on them, but this artist is choosing to simplify that in a unique way. Nice use of silhouette shapes back here, just using that shadow. But this one has a really cool look at it using very simplified light and shadow. And just one color on there creates a really cool look for this comic. Okay, how would you describe the highlight and shadow on these on this landscape study? So this looks like a digital landscape study. How would you describe the colors used on the lights and shadow there in this illustration? Yes, warm color for what, Valentina? The highlights or the shadows? Yep, exactly. So this is an example of warm highlights, cool shadows. So this creates, you can feel that the sun is coming from over in this direction. Let me put this one. So you can feel here in this one that the light source is coming from over here. So it's hitting this edge of all these shadows here, or all the highlights there. So it's hitting the highlight on the same edge of all those hills. So using that warm color for the highlights, and then these shadows are all cool blues and purples. So that's a really nice way to create that dramatic difference. And then it also makes those highlights really pop. So it really grabs the viewer's attention there, because the highlights are pretty much the only warm color in the scene. Everything else is purples, greens, and blues. So all kind of analogous colors down here and all the shadows. And then highlights are those oranges and yellows. You guys use the color picker here in Photoshop? So it's this tool right here. But if I hold down, if I'm using my brush and then I hold down Option, that allows me just to suck up the color. So sometimes I'll use this to analyze a photograph or something that I see. And I'm not quite sure, like, what is this color back here that they're using for the shadow? I can suck it up and it displays the color right here. Oh, this is like a desaturated middle value blue. And so that can help me to figure out colors. And you can even leave this color picker open, kind of pick different colors. So, oh, this color here, oh, that's a dark purple here. We got a desaturated kind of reddish purple there in the sand. So that's a good way to kind of analyze and help you look at color if you ever have a digital file or a photograph. But yeah, really dramatic use of that warm highlights, cool shadows there. Here's another very simplified scene. Again, pretty much the only shadow they have on here is this, are the cast shadows. So cast shadows under the signs, cast shadow under these awnings. So they're not really including that much, you know, subtly variance in highlight and shadow, but just this nice cast shadow helps create the feeling of that sunny day. And they're using a subtly cool shadow. So this color is cooler than the highlights, but it's not as dramatic as this one that we just looked at. So this is dramatically warm and dramatically cool. This one is more subtly warm here and subtly cool there. So that can be another way to do it when you don't want it to be quite as dramatic and difference in there. This is just some nice, simple, flat two-tone coloring. So two-tone coloring is just where you have one color for the highlight and one color for the shadow. No highlights on there or anything else. I should just write that down for you guys. So two-tone color. Two-tone color. So yeah, the fire is creating the highlights there. So this is the highlight on the hair, and then just one color for highlight, one color for shadow, one color for highlight skin, one color for shadow skin. This eyebrow is in the light, this eyebrow is in the shadow. One color for the highlight of the red, one color for the shadow of the red. So sometimes sometimes you can have two-tone coloring with a highlight in there too. There are, subtle differences in that, but for the most part, this is just using that simple flat two-tone coloring. They're not worried about, rendering, making that core shadow have a soft edge at all. And this is the style I use a lot. So let's kind of start thinking about, as you experiment, finishing up this second project, what style, kind of works with how you like to work, how you like to create different stuff. And the simple shading goes with the simple kind of drawing style where all these trees are just simplified into triangular shapes, which I think is really cool. All the little grasses and flowers here in the foreground are very simplified, so it all works together to create a nice unified style there. So it is helpful to just look at these different artists and see how they do it. Here's another one. So here's a close-up of the same artist. So this artist, she does more rendered drawings, but I thought this is cool because here in this shadow on the underside of the head, she has both some warm color and some cool color in there. So that's a very kind of sophisticated use of that shadow. And actually, if you're observing and painting from real life, within the shadow, you will see some areas that are warm and some areas that are cool. But this artist does a very cool job of kind of doing a simplified version where you get some cool and some warm in the shadow. So she really made that into kind of her stylistic choice there. But a really cool style. So you see it here along the legs and the knees where you get some cool and some warm as well. So here you see two-tone coloring, but this one does have a highlight on there. So this is using this cool blue as the highlight on all of the characters' faces there and on the hair as well. So simple two-tone coloring with a hard-edged highlight. So I said I did those highlights with a very low opacity brush. Some artists will do it with a hard edge as well. So you can experiment with both. and see what you like. So yeah, there's not one right or wrong way to handle this. It's really just kind of about practicing and seeing what works best with your own style. Well, here's an example of flat coloring. So there's no shadows on here. So no highlights, no shadows, no nothing, just flat color. So that can be a style you experiment with too. But I'd like to see you guys try some highlights and shadows at some point in the final art. And this one is cool because you can see a little bit of that soft edge. So this is kind of a stylized soft edge here along this core shadow. So it looks like watercolor was used for this. So this is probably gouache and watercolor, traditionally colored. It's not digitally colored here. This is an older book from, I think, early 2000s. But you can see that kind of just a textured edge. So rather than having that be a really crisp line, crisp edge for those shadows, it's just a softer edge there along there. But you still do get the warmer highlights and the cooler shadow values there. All right, so that's pretty good. Oh, typical head lighting. Here's some typical ways that the head is lit. If you want to just see some different types of lighting there on the head. So from the side, this is probably the most common one, just from the top down. Here's with the light underneath the head shining up, lighting from the side. So different ways you'll see. So you can see this in a lot of different movies and different dramatic scenes. They'll move those lights around the head to get different effects. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. Any questions on light and shadow, color, anything like that, or any questions on the project before it's due? So if there's nothing, that will be it for today. I'll leave this open for a minute. If anyone has any individual questions, projects due tomorrow. Remember, you can email me stuff later today or tomorrow morning if you want me to check over anything before you turn it in. But other than that, I will have a drawing challenge for you guys later in the week that will be dealing with light and shadow in some way. And yeah, and then I'll start grading your projects probably Thursday and Friday. But other than that, I will see you guys in a week.